The views and opinions expressed in this recording do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Logan City Council. Logan City Council does not make any representation of the accuracy of any such views and opinions.
Welcome to this podcast, one of a number on the Logan City Council Library's website. Recorded in front of a live audience, today's conversation is a special Writers and Creators event featuring Angela Slatter. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our wonderful guest speaker. Angela is the author of the urban fantasy novels Vigil and Corpse Light, as well as 8 short story collections. The third novel in the Verity Fassbinder series, Restoration, will be released in 2018 by Joe Fletcher Books. Angela has won a World Fantasy Award, a British Fantasy Award, a Ditmar and 6 Aurealis Awards. Her short stories have featured in a number of Australian, UK and US anthologies for new horror, fantasy and speculative fiction. Angela's work has been translated into Bulgarian, Russian, Spanish, Japanese, Polish and Romanian. Everyone, please make Angela welcome. To commence tonight's proceedings, Angela is actually going to read from Corpse Light.
I am. And we'll see how we go at the end. I might then read the opening of Restoration, which is the third book that's only just been delivered to the publisher. So, mud. She took a while getting out of her car, smoothing the workday creases from her Dorina Karen suit, collecting a handbag and the briefcase. She jingled the keys before inserting them in the lock of the house's front door, as if the noise might ward off evil spirits, as if it might let them know she was home and they should disappear now. The hallway looked fine, but the smell hit her before she'd stepped inside. Had she caused it, she wondered, with her expectation? She shook her head. Magical thinking would get her nowhere. Steeling herself, she followed the stench. Mud. Again. It was all over the expensive silk and wool rug at the base of the new rocker recliner that had replaced the last one. Oblongs of insufficiently jellified gunk, almost like footprints but lacking definition. Up close, the odour was even worse. The whole chair was covered in a thick coat of the same crap, and it wasn't just mud, but oozing filth, fetid, contaminated, liquefied death. This was the third such occurrence in as many months. Always on the same day. The mess was always there when she returned from work. The perpetrator clearly waited until she'd left, then set about making its point, always in the same spots. None of her precautions had done a damned thing. She'd be having words with that bloody hippie chick at the St. Lucia spook shop about her rubbish ingredients. She couldn't imagine the insurance company would pay out. Not again, even under the unnatural happenstance provision. The first time this had happened, she'd been unnerved, even afraid. The second time, she'd been annoyed. Tricks, she'd thought. Shitty little tricks. Shitty, spiteful little tricks. This time, the only thing on her mind was, fuck you. It'll take a damn sight more than this, she shouted at the empty room, making sure her anger carried the words all the way through the house. There was more, of course. The kitchen was awash with brown slither marks, patterning the linoleum as if a nest of medium-sized snakes had run amok. The biggest puddle was in front of the fridge. Well, that was new. She picked her way across the floor, stepping on the clean patches, careful not to slip, not to get sludge on her expensive new Nicholas Kirkwood Carnaby Prism pumps. The handle of the fridge was pristine. She grasped it and pulled. There was a moment, one of those frozen seconds when things stand still. In theory, in that moment, there was time to step away, to jump to safety. In reality, the shit-brown rectangle filling the matte silver Fisher & Paykel quivered and slid out onto the neutral patent leather of her Kirkwoods with an obscene sucking sound, leaving her shin-deep in muck. And then the doorbell rang.
Thank you. Angela, thank you for that reading. As you know, a number of our audience here may not have read the books. Can we put up a hand if you have read one of the Verity books? Oh, we've got a couple here. But if I said to you in 3 or 4 sentences or less, tell us what this glorious trilogy is about, could you do it?
I could. Probably. It's an urban fantasy story set in Brisbane, and it follows the trails and travails of Verity Fassbinder, who has one normal parent and one weird parent. And the weird are sort of my catch-all group for the unnatural, the ghostly, the vampires, the werewolves, the mix in between, the golems, the kitsune, all manner of mythical creatures who are in Brisbane and living quietly and secretly. They cover themselves with glamours if their bodies look too different to ours, if they can't get away with it. If they've got horns, then sometimes people just think it's a body modification and no one really thinks about it. But if they're considerably more different than that, then they have a glamour over the top, so they look relatively normal. And Verity keeps the peace between the normal and the weird world. And she works for the Weird Council, investigating incidents, murders, cake shops. That's pretty much it.
What were you like as a child? Because I look at, if you read this book, the world of Angela's imagination is full of very unusual people and places and creatures, and they're all here in Brisbane. So what were you like as a child?
I was very, very quiet and very well behaved, which changed later on when I got to about 25. Then I had my terrible teenage years. I was just a little bit slow. And I read a lot, and that was what I did. I was really lucky because my parents didn't censor anything that I read. Mum probably wishes she had now, but I just read anything and everything, and mythology and legend and fairy stories and religion. And specifically fairy stories, because they were what Mum read to me, and her voice for me is always the voice of storytelling. So I've had a few editors say to me, I love your stories because it's like you're sitting down telling me the story. You're sitting there next to me, which could be creepy, but it's you're not allowed to follow people home. But I think that's what I'm trying to create, is my mother's storytelling voice, because she is the person who gave me tales in the first place. So I used to read a lot, and in my head I would rework the stories if I didn't like the ends of them. Sort of pre-fan fiction, I guess. I would tell myself the ending that I did like, and that was pretty much me as a child.
So did you tell the stories to other children, or did you write them down? What came
I didn't.
First?
I didn't write them down. I just did it all in my head. But I mean, one of the jokes that my sister and I have, we lived out at Longreach for about 18 months because my dad was a police officer, so we moved around. And for years, I remember winning first prize at the Longreach show for creative writing for a story about a vampire rising out of a mud pit. Except we recently found the actual certificate. My sister won it.
Oh, no.
So she's just saying, you stole my career.
So you both thought?
We both thought. Oh. We both thought that. It was just hilarious. And it was something that I loved doing and I dreamt about, but I didn't think I could be a writer because, it was mysterious. Yeah. And you had to do it from a garret in Paris where you starved and simultaneously ate croissants. So it just didn't. It was a dream, but it wasn't something I thought I could actually do.
So when did you start writing?
In my teenage years, I did start scribbling. Just university school assignments and then university assignments. But I don't think I sent anything out for years and years. But I did keep writing and just chipping away and trying to learn by doing. And also reading, still reading, always reading, a lot of reading. And when I moved to Sydney at the end of 1999, and had said to my mum, I need to be somewhere different. I need to learn how to write somewhere else, and I need to be in a different environment. And I lived in Sydney for 4 years, and I didn't write a word. Because life was so busy and work was so busy and it was so demanding. It was a really frantic lifestyle of having so many acquaintances but no close friends and no family down there. And I got to 37 and I hated my job and I was trying to work out what to do. And quite literally, one of my cousins rang and said, we've bought a house at Mapleton and there's a granny flat. And if you wanted to come and live with us and write, that would be okay with us. And I turned around and I walked in and I wrote my resignation letter and I handed it in. And within a month I was back in Queensland and just up in Mapleton and writing, and I wrote everything, and I wrote it badly, but I wrote it, and I got to the point after 6 months of thinking, okay, now I need some training. So I applied to the graduate diploma course at QUT, and I did that. That was my first year, and I enjoyed it. And then they said, well, you should probably do a master's. I said, yes, I should. And I got into the master's program and wrote a collection called Black Winged Angels. All of those stories were published, which just encouraged me, really. You know, they shouldn't have done it. So I did that. That was a year and a half. And then 2007 I started a PhD in creative writing. So, as I said, it just encouraged me and I haven't really stopped since. So that was 13 years ago that I decided I wanted to do it seriously, because I didn't want to get, to my deathbed and thinking, oh, I wish I'd tried, I wish I'd done it, and if I hadn't tried, well, I certainly wouldn't have failed because I wouldn't have tried anything. So that was just my, moment on the road to Damascus, that I had to do it and the stories wanted to come out. And I have never been as happy in anything I've ever done in my entire life as I am with writing. So I found my home, thank God.
You've obviously learnt the art of writing very well with all this study, and so here's the point. So can you step our audience through the intricacies of urban fantasy, speculative fiction, and weird fiction, and how did you blend all these elements with a classic noir private detective story to create the Verity Fassbinder trilogy? Gasp.
I would love to facetiously say it was all a mistake. But when I started doing the masters, I was looking for stories to write, to rewrite and to learn from. And my supervisor suggested fairy tales, and she said, "What's the first one you remember?" And it was Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl. And I remember it because it was the first one that made me cry, and being so distressed about it. And I sat on the bus with a cocktail napkin, because I might have been in a bar, and wrote the story. Just wrote it out on the cocktail napkin, with a lot of bumps and spelling mistakes and everything. But I got that draft out and I got that first tale there. So that's your speculative element. That's the fairy tale. The whole thing with speculative fiction is that it's the umbrella term for horror, fantasy, science fiction, all of the hybrids in between there. So it's basically the literature of what if. Weird fiction, I have a bit of a thing with the term because there's a great anthology by Jeff Vandermeer and his wife Anne called The New Weird, or The Big Book of the Weird, something like that. And a lot of the stories in there are some newer ones, but there are also the older ones, and they are M.R. James, and they're those old strange tales from the 1800s and the 1900s that to me were ghost stories or just the strange tale. So I kind of feel like weird is someone rebranded it, someone from marketing got to it, and as for the noir, the crime part, I read crime as my recreation. And I didn't ever think I'd write it because I didn't think I could. I didn't, you read some of those intricate plots and I was just like, oh God, I'm not that smart. So I think my friend Lisa just sort of said, you can see that you've read so much, it's just coming up through the DNA of Vigil. So it's probably only natural that I did end up, turning into a wisecracking noir private eye as my narrator. And the way Vigil came about, can I answer that?
Please do.
Sure. I attended a writing course called Clarion South in Brisbane in 2009, which is 6 weeks of you and 15 other writers producing one story a week, and then having it critiqued by the other people in your class. And in a Brisbane summer, producing writing under high pressure situations, and not necessarily getting much sleep, you all turned a bit feral. So I think it was about a week 3 or a week 4 story, and I was looking for the story. I always said I'd put my stories in for Monday critique, so I had to have them done Sunday night. Because I just figure you may as well get the pain out of the way at the start of the week and then relax a bit. And I was listening to a lot of Powderfinger and a lot of In Excess, and it was that hideous sweaty heat, and I'm just sort of sitting there and tapping and tapping and tapping and tapping and what, what's happening here? What's I need a voice in my head. And then In Excess's Never Tear Us Apart came on, and there's that line, I'll make wine from your tears. And I went, there, that's it. Someone is stealing children. They are making wine from the tears. The underbelly of this city is the weird society. That's where I'm going with this. And then I got Verity's voice in my head, and it's just that wisecracking. It's a beat. It's a beat in the city. Is her voice. It's like a pulse. So I ended up with a short story called Brisneyland by Night, which was published later that year in an anthology called Sprawl. And a bunch of editors and publishers kept coming to me saying, well, where's the novel? Because, that's fantastic, that's got legs. And I'm going, ah! So that was kind of where it came from.
That's amazing, actually.
Pure accident.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, maybe your father, the Longreach police officer, and maybe Verity's based on someone in your family closet, or
no one can fit in our closet. But Dad as a copper, and I was talking about this last night at Avid. We used to drive around Brisbane, and he would point out where people had been murdered. This was my normal. This is these are mums of fairy tales and dads murder tales, and these are the voices that give me my stories. So, and Betty Shanks was killed there, and this sort of thing, and all of these things. So again, crime is kind of just so ingrained. And he also used to leave his Australian police journals lying around the house, so I used to look at autopsy photos from a very young age. But I wasn't stupid enough to let them know. Good Lord. So that was part of it was just that having that kind of an influence there and reading matter.
Fantastic. With Verity, what I love about her is she's just so complicated. You know, that saying that we all say now, it's complicated, really suits Verity. You know, I mean, she's got a complicated family life. In the new book, Corpse Light, we have a baby. She's juggling this breast pump, and she's also monster hunting, and she's got a detective career to keep going. There's a lot happening, and yet she has an awful lot of fun.
Yes.
Where does this humour come from?
That's just me. That is. I think the only way you survive is that you have a lot of humour in life, and if you look at things too seriously, then your heart is not going to recover from anything that happens to you. And I think Verity is just that. She sums that up for me, is that you just have to get on with life. Here you go, TMI. Last year, the week before Vigil launched, I broke up with my partner David. I tore the meniscus in my right knee. I had 4 weeks to recover before going on a book tour of the UK. My sister was diagnosed with breast cancer. Earlier in the year, my uncle had been diagnosed with a brain tumour. So basically, my life was a tyre fire, and the only way I got through it was with humour and being Verity and just going on. And you just have to keep going on, because you can sit in the middle of the road and cry. No one's going to pick you up but yourself. So I just... That's just my attitude to life, and I sort of, I suppose Verity's a bit of an avatar of that. I love the idea that she is dealing with these strange things. You know, there are sirens fighting with angels over the city. There's a garbage golem in the streets of the valley sweeping up the homeless. Children are being stolen and basically milked until they're dead for their tears. There's kind of a Hansel and Gretel thing happening with a house in there. But she's still got to get up in the morning. She's still got to make sure there's some bread in the house and that there's clean socks. And, So all of those things, and that's what I do like with this series, is just mixing the mundane with the strange and seeing how she copes.
Very much so. And I think what I love about it is, that mundane, but also here we are tonight, we're in Logan. A lot of the events are set in Brisbane and around really iconic old houses with a real history in themselves. And it really, you look at Brisbane in a totally different light when you read a book like this or that series. But can you give us a little bit of, how much research did you have to go into to paint those iconic, pictures of this, Brisbane?
For me, it always starts with the visual. It's it's what I see, and things like the Wesley Hospital and the main house that's there. That's really fascinating to me. And there was a legend at some point that one of the mains had thrown himself out of the top floor window, which is not true, but it's just one of those things. It's one of those tales that's there. Similarly, the old windmill up on
the terrace.
The terrace. That's just one of those weird kind of places, and they're old. They're items of colonisation, but they're old. They're old for our young society. And one of the things that really does infect this series is the idea of bringing our ghosts with us, and bringing our myths with us, and our religions, and that, and what memories we bring that are kind of inherited from families. One of my friends, Angie, is from Sicilian heritage, and she will still tell you the magic that her grandmother, would tell her at her knee. Oh, if you're not sleeping, then put a glass of water under the bed. In the morning, your bad dreams will have gone into the water. So pour it out, which I ended up using in the Bitterwood Bible collection. My mum only recently told me this story that she wouldn't put red and white pegs on the line together because years ago they were decorating for a celebration in the police station in Cairns, and there were red and white streamers together, and they got notice that a friend had just died. So in her head, this red and white combination is not. That they cannot be paired together, or something bad will happen. So for someone who is, very normal, my mum, this is a kind of a magic that I have learned from her, this kind of a folk and a personal magic. And I can't remember what the original question was because I just keep talking. Someone should stop me. But yet research, locations and that sort of thing. The idea of the tunnels in Vigil, the Brisbane Toof tunnels, is because you go into the King George Square bus station and you can see the old, the Wheat Street culvert, it's called. So it's preserved, it's there, and it's this item of the past just sticking into the future. When I was turning Brisneyland by Night into Vigil, I love the Kangaroo Point Cliffs, and I love that area by the river, and I used to walk there because I don't drive, I get public transport or I walk. You see the city differently. And the little church, St Mary's, that's next to it, David and I had sort of been on the cliffs, and then we went and had a look at the church, and he was the one who pointed out that it looked as though part of the building had been torn away, that, there was a room missing. And that was where I got the idea. I just went, oh, well, that's where the baby's been hidden. That's where the Siren Angel baby's been hidden. So it's that kind of thing. And in Corpse Light, I specifically wanted to mention Newstead House because it's, it's one of the oldest remaining residents around. So we went and we had a day there and just wandered through and took ridiculous amounts of photos and filled up the camera. But in the end, I decided I just wanted to put the Undine down on the rocks where she could steal picnic baskets. And Toorak House, which is up the hill on the other side, I had never seen before, but we just went for a drive. And I went, right, that's what the Bishop's Palace looks like. That's where the weird council is located. That's where Sandor Verhoeven, who is the head of the council, lives. So that was, you can't really get in. They get very upset if you try and climb the fence. Just saying. And but it gave me the visual that I needed for how I wanted this place to look. So it's a big thing about wandering.
You could really do, instead of Harry Potter tours, we could do the Angela Slatter Verity Fassbinder tours, seriously. And you can do Brisbane Open House, give them a run for their money. Because seriously, like I went past St Mary's Kangaroo Point Cliffs on Saturday and stopped, had to walk around, and I just immediately, I was right there. So definitely.
That is actually one of my favourite scenes, is the angels and the sirens having the battle on the lawn at St Mary's. That is the battle for Hogwarts in the last Harry Potter book. That's my battle for Hogwarts. That is the one that I feel like, where is my sword, where is my shield? That's something I'm so proud of having written. And I just love that scene.
And rightly so. Thank you. Now, the map in the front of the books.
All that was that my publisher had sort of said, well, what's the area like? And I just said, well, it's this part of Google Maps. And the editorial assistant at Joe Fletcher Books was also an artist, and that's Nicola Howell. And so she went through the book and she drew the map. She drew the map. She just did that with the creatures. And I know you've got a question on there about Norman Park.
Don't tell them.
It is the house I used to live in at
excellent.
Tennyson Street in Norman Park, because that was the house I was living in when I wrote Brisneyland by Night, and when I was doing the initial drafts of Vigil. And it does have a gigantic jacaranda tree out the back, and it's the best jacaranda tree in the neighbourhood.
Yeah.
So very competitive about that.
West End?
West End, I used to hang out there a lot when I was living in Tennyson Street. My housemate and I used to say, "Oh, well, we're going for breakfast, so we'll go over to West End." And the Little Venice is kind of based on, I don't know if it's still there, it used to be called the Sling Bar. And then there was another one across the road that I think was Cafe Babylon, which did have, the vines over top of the roof. So I kind of mashed them together. And another reader said she was just very disappointed that there wasn't a series of underground, canals in Brisbane, and that's why it was called Little Venice. But West End is one of those places that feels like it does constantly resist rehabilitation. It's never going to be bright and shiny, and that's kind of why I thought that's it. That's the home of the weird. They're dotted across the city, but West End, that's the heart. That's where and that's kind of why the Norns are set up there.
Who make a very mean latte.
Yes, and
as well. So some of these fantastical creatures, so we've talked about the bird-like sirens, there's the distant and imperious angels, there's the deadly golems, there's the gnomes, and there's the thieving undines. Have I said that right? Or
yes.
Is it undines?
Undines.
Can you tell us how you came about this huge cast of creatures? And what's your favourite one?
Oh,
got to know which was your favourite.
You'll have to ask me that after I finish this answer.
First part.
Someone come on, remember what I'm saying.
Yep.
As I said, I've always read the mythology and legends and that sort of thing, and I have been doing it for a really long time, since I could read independently. So there's a treasure chest in my head, or a crap box, it depends on your point of view, with everything in there. And so I just sort of look at the situation, and I look at the location, and I think, well, what would be interesting for her to have to deal with? I lived in New Farm many years ago, and again, it's one of those places, the valley, it's always grubby, bless it. It's always dirty. And I just remember, if you're going to have a golem, make it garbage, something that, which is also inspired by seeing, whirlwinds pick everything up. There's quite a beautiful one that, you can see on Facebook, which is Petals after Poppy Day in the UK. And it's just this amazing cyclone of red petals up and down the street and that sort of thing. And that was kind of the visual that I was after with the garbage golem, but with garbage. So so that was one of them. The angels, I just really liked the idea that they're with Vigil, that they're starving. Faith is so shrunk. But the other thing, and it's one of the things that I talk about in Restoration, is that there is more than one God in the world. There's not just a Christian God. There is so much else going, and they're all competing. All of these gods, all these religions, all these faiths, they're competing. So what happens? So I like the idea that the angels, your traditional angels that we're all told are, bringing tidings of comfort and joy, actually don't like us very much. Because we're basically the special needs kids of God. Sorry, that was a terrible thing, but this is how they see us. That we have no control over ourselves. We don't get punished, but the angels are there doing the right thing all the time, and what do they get? Bupkis, starved. So. That, and then I was sort of thinking, what's the opposite? Well, there's your sirens. And again, they're all appetite. They too have wings, but they're not liked by the angels either. And I quite like the idea that I in my head, the angels were always male, and the sirens were always female. So that was just how that came about. And as for my favourite weird, they'll all get upset with me. I really like the Norns, actually. I think that's it, because they're, and I like the idea that they tell fortunes, but, only one of them tells true. One of them always lies, and the other one will make your future, but you don't know which one does which. And the idea is that in some ways they've forgotten themselves. They can't remember either. So I like the idea of that Norse idea of, the weavers weaving fate, and the one who cuts the fate line off, and this sort of thing. But they're there, and they've kind of got a even though they're, it's a Norse inflection, they've all got Greek names. And they're in Brisbane dispensing cake and coffee, and they're kind of the clearinghouse for information in this world. So if there's a rumour, this is where you go, this is where the pulse is. Whether they'll tell you or not is another matter. Depends on what they owe you.
I love that fight scene. In Vigil with the angel attacking Thais. Yeah, that was one of my favourites. And then I think Verity feels like in Corpse Light that she's got an endless supply of coffee and cake.
Yes,
as a result, which is appeals.
As she keeps pointing out to the Norns, I saved your life.
Yeah.
An angel was wailing on you, and I saved all of your lives, and that should translate to a lifetime of coffee and cake, if nothing else does.
Oh, I love it. In your books, the living and the dead mix, and sometimes in very surprising ways. Can you tell us a little bit? In Corpse Light, we've got the Guardian of the Underworld. We've got the title of our book is Corpse Light. And, of course, the Boatman appears in Book 1 and Book 2. And I hope the Boatman is coming into Book 3. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about these wonderful characters?
I think it probably comes from reading all the ghost stories. And I've always been quite convinced that there are other things vibrating beside us, that we can't necessarily see, but we can feel. My parents had a long-term cat that used to always jump on my bed, and even after this cat was gone in that particular house at a particular time, I would feel her on the bed. I would feel her jump on the bed, and sort of sit up and go, oh no, wait a minute, she's not there. Sometimes I wake in the house that I'm in and I can feel someone lie on the bed beside me, but no one's there. And there's no screams, so that's all good. There's nothing to worry about. I remember my parents telling me years ago that they'd gone up to Cairns for a friend's funeral, and this friend was always obsessed with everyone being on time, and they had forgotten to set their alarm the next day, and they needed to catch a flight. And at 4 a.m, something shook the bed. Something just shook the bed like mad. And they got up and they thought, what? Is there a dog in there or something like that? No, that was it. And they both felt it, and they both, So it's. I think we're so close, and I don't think we have any answers about what happens to you afterwards. We have things we hope, but we don't have any guarantees. We don't know. So I kind of like the idea that there is the boatman, and he will conduct the souls, and he'll take them on. He'll take them to the underworld, but that's just a clearinghouse. So there's other things that you have to do. There are other places to go. And I like the idea with Corpse Light that in order to pass on from there, you have to let all your memories go. They'll be returned to you later, but before you can be let go, you have to let these memories go. Then they'll be delivered back to you and your heart will be weighed, and then you could be in serious trouble. So they're that's the sort of a theme that is going on there. I had written an unrelated short story called The Heart is a Mirror for Sinners, and that used the idea of corpse lights, because traditionally they were seen on the tops of graves in graveyards, which, sometimes they're the souls of the dead, sometimes they're unbaptised children, sometimes they're mischievous sprites that are going to lead you astray, walk you across the moors and let you go over a cliff or something like that. So I always, with Corpse Light, I always had the idea of these corpse lights coming into Verity's backyard, but her not understanding what they wanted or who they were. So that thread kind of developed as I wrote, and I was, in the middle of going, I don't know what I'm doing with it. Oh my God, I know what I'm doing with it. I know who they are. And just sort of that moment of revelation was really, really very convenient, because I had no idea what I was doing. So
Look, it works beautifully.
Excellent.
And I do love the boatman. That's the scenes of him down the Brisbane River. I can never look at the Brisbane River again the same way. And the fog comes out. The fog turns up just before he...
I also like the idea he's kind of cool.
Yes,
he's
he
like
totally
the
is.
Fonzie of the underworld.
Yeah.
So he's just cool.
Yeah,
that's it.
He is. Protection runes.
Yes.
So Verity is shown how to use them to save various family members and friends against grand drowning.
The grand drowning spell.
And part of the story is also based around recovering a stolen labradorite crystal. And it turns out labradorites are hugely symbolic. So again, I guess it's research, but can you tell us a little bit how you decided on the rituals and the symbols?
Again, a lot of reading about witchcraft and magic, and I again that idea of a very personal kind of craft magic. The things that I picked up for Vigil initially about the idea of writing spells on the doorways and burying bread with lavender in it in the four corners of the house for protection, go back to old magical formulas. There was a island had very few witch trials, and someone, there's a school of thought that says because it was a culture so steeped in the idea of the little folk and the fairy and the fae, so the idea of witchcraft was never something terrifying. So there was something like 4 witchcraft trials compared to 687 or something like that in Scotland over the same period. But again, a lot more Christianity and repression in the Scottish character in that period. But there was one of those witch trials in Ireland was Dame Alice Keitela, and she was accused of doing a variety of things, of baking breads like that, and also sweeping towards her house and using the spell words, "Bring all the wealth of Kilkenny to me." So that idea of doing that, and I like the idea of defensive actions that don't require anything more than baking of a loaf of bread or runes. And the Tafnir one that I use in there is genuinely a Viking rune against drowning. So it's the research and it's what you're looking for. And with the one of the monsters in Corpse Light, the water eidolon, I thought, how can I make Verity's life more difficult? She's got weird strength. Normally she's super strong. That's her only inheritance from her father, from the weird side of that. But as she got pregnant, and more pregnant, not a little bit pregnant, but a lot pregnant, she lost her strength. So like that whole Samson having a bad haircut thing. So even if she has her own strength back, how do you hit water? How do you fight against that? How do you work against something that... And the water eidolon is... it's a servant of someone else. So it's not a thinking creature. You can't reason with it. There's no organs. You can't knee it in the groin. It's just not going to work. So, you know, how do I make her life more difficult? And that was it.
Yeah.
So did I answer the question?
I think you did, except I wanted to know where these shops were. Because, you know, when you're in the one where, you know, the giant crystal's been stolen, I really felt like I was in that shop.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm sure there were far more shops around in the olden days that had all, you know, crystals and weird things and hanging and, you know, people behind counters who looked suitably impressive.
There's a good one over at Stone's Corner, which was one that I did used to hang out in a lot. So apart from the fact they always smell really good. But there's that one there. There isn't one at St Lucia, unfortunately. Merrily Vaughan's, you know, I just kind of transplanted that. But I did like the idea that if you're going to have a spook shop somewhere where, you know, people would sell charms and do tarot cards, you'd put it in the middle of St Lucia where bored rich housewives can take advantage of it, and students who want a much better result in their exam can go in and pay for a spell.
Perfect. I guess, as you mentioned, you've got Restoration coming out next year. When you've put Verity to bed, will you put her to bed? But what comes next? Have you got any other projects that you're planning that you can tell us about?
I do. I have 3 other Verity books, another proposed trilogy, but, you know, with the vagaries of publishing, that will depend on how well these books go, whether they, you know, whether there is enough call for another series. What I am doing next is turning a novella that I wrote last year, which is unpublished, called The Briar Book of the Dead, into a novel. It's set in the sourdough world, the fairy tale world that I wrote for Sourdough and Other Stories and the Bitterwood Bible and other recountings. And it has the tagline, "Sometimes witches must burn their own." So again, it's witchcraft and fairy tale. And there's a girl called Annie Briar, who is the only one of 5 cousins who doesn't have any magic in her family. And the way that story started, there's a book by Catherine Arnold called Necropolis, London and Her Dead. And in the start of it, it talks about the reason you wore black to a funeral was so the ghosts couldn't recognise you. Everyone looked the same. Someone had apparently decided ghosts think we all look alike, and they couldn't tell you apart. So I thought, what if, you know, and then I went and I wrote a little bit which was about a woman called Hela who wore red to her husband's funeral because she wanted him to recognise her and she wanted him to see her dance. And then there's a whole range of things that happen that put Annie into danger, and there's mysteries that she must solve. And one of them is that she falls and hits her head at her grandmother's funeral, and the blood is there and the blood is red, so the ghosts can suddenly see her. And this girl who had no magical power suddenly becomes a speaker for the dead. So all the dead of this town called Silverton come to her and say, "We can't move on if you don't fix the things we stuffed up in life." So she's investigating mysteries, she's trying not to get burned, and trying not to upset the priests that have come into the town again, and she's trying to settle the debts of the restless dead. So that's kind of what I'm doing for the rest of the year.
You're going to have to live for a very, 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 very long time.
That is my plan.
You've got so many stories to tell us. Now, I always finish off with our author events asking what books or authors resonated with them, or even I know, heard you say that you love crime. What are you reading at the moment?
What I have just finished is Sarah Bailey's The Dark Lake. I'm reading Jane Harper's The Dry, which is quite great fabulous. The author I wait for every year is John Connolly, the Irish crime writer. So I've just finished A Game of Ghosts, which is his latest. And I'm always telling myself that I will pace myself every year, and then 24 hours later I've gone, and I have to start the reread again and wait until it, email him and say, so John, shut up Angela. But I always go back to anything by Tanith Lee, who died last year, but she is one of those authors that I sort of consider an influence. Her and Angela Carter probably most of my fairy tale work as well. So I have a very big pile next to my bed, but that's pretty much off the top of my head what I am reading and enjoying.
Thank you, Angela.
You're more than welcome.
Now, would you like to do a reading from Restoration?
If the audience would like it, I'll just read this, which has been delivered to the publisher. But Lord, I should have printed it out much bigger. Oh. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, thought the archangel, and had to stop himself from giggling. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Although not today it wasn't. Today it was firmly seated on a mountain top, watching the world go by, big feet planted in the snow of Musala Peak in the Rila Mountains. The rough sack robe was doing little against the cold, not that it would have any effect on either the angel or the deity. A deity. If the angel had learned anything in its very long life, it was that there was more than one God on this planet, this plane, this place, and their powers and influence waxed and waned according to the belief of the mortals worshipping or ignoring them. And the angelic choir's own strength, much to its chagrin, also depended on this. Ramiel the archangel, the thunder of God, felt the tremors each time a heresy, be it Albigensian, Nestorian, something new from the Fraticelli, whatever, arose amongst the faithful. Questioning brought doubt, a weakening of the creed, and a dwindling of their own power. One of the high and holy, it was one of the deities chosen, and its purview was to watch over those who rose from the dead. Ramiel knew what he, had to do to rescue them all, that it had to marshal what was being allowed to stagnate, take it by whatever means, and become something new himself. To rise higher, to ensure that the faith, the belief, and the credence did not fade or fail. He'd been loyal for such an age. He'd been so utterly believing. He'd been resolute and steadfast for eons, and he had stood by the deity, even as the Shining One made its own power play. This was not a treason he'd come to lightly. And it had taken the archangel a long time to find what was needed. The thing had had many lives and passed through many hands. It had been lost and found over and again. It had borne myriad names, but two had stuck. One was the dagger of Wilusa, the Bronze Age settlement sometimes mistaken for Troy, where the weapon had once been found, but it was far older than that. Some said it had been wielded by Zeus to kill Kronos. With it, Abraham had intended to sacrifice his son. Incan priests had used it to cut hearts from chests. It had belonged to the Amazon queens of old, passed from mother to daughter. Latterly, it had been in the possession of the Brotherhood of Boatmen. Its true history was of no concern to the archangel. In any case, Ramiel preferred the other name, although he certainly did not whisper it as he strode the vaults of heaven or the plains of earth. He'd kept its possession secret, avoiding the temptation to boast of its finding to his brothers. He'd never mentioned his search for the thing, fearing that no one would understand his duty, his obligation, his need to set matters to rights. The archangel pulled the Godslayer from its sheath. The metal whispered the merest song, but Ramiel felt the weapon heating up. He watched the cold sunlight glint on the sharp edge, almost distracted by the watery sheen, before remembering his purpose. The all-seeing, all-knowing didn't even turn around. Too trusting, too weary, too long past its time. Nothing like it was meant to be. Ramiel raised the dagger and plunged it into the surprisingly slender back. Jagged shards of fire poured forth, silver and savage from the rent godflesh. If the deity made any sound, Ramiel couldn't hear it over his own screaming, for the light was burning him as surely as molten mercury. It seared and scorched an inferno of strange heat and eldritch flame that appeared to fracture the deity, although that might have been Ramiel's fevered mind playing tricks on him in those few seconds that lasted an eternity. At last, though, it felt like his agony had ended. He broke away from the conflagration of god and archangel, of melting mountaintop that would be recorded as an unexpected volcanic eruption in the history of the realer monks. The intensity of the pain was such that he ceased to feel it. He could no longer see the splitting of the god, indeed ceased to have much grip at all on his sanity, although, if asked, his brethren would have ventured that to attempt what he had, his reason had clearly already departed. Ramiel turned and spun as if released from an oppressive grip, and then he fell and continued to fall. Thank you.
On behalf of Logan City Council Libraries, I'd like to thank Angela for joining us today. Can I also remind everyone that you can visit the Logan City Council Libraries website to hear other recordings featuring thought-provoking conversations with interesting people. Thank you also to our audience for joining us for this special event. Thank you. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.